Greetings. I'm Nikon Balial of Global Justice Journal, and I have the pleasure of moderating a panel discussion today along with Stefan Ziegler, Ashok Panikar, Gary Mason, and Godwin A. Okoko around the question: does international law provide language for meaningful dialogue? Going ahead and introducing our speakers for today, Ashok Panikar, an international conflict mediator and founder of Metaculture, a global organization committed to helping people develop the knowledge, skills, and understanding needed to build and sustain a culture of democracy. Second, we have Reverend Dr. Gary Mason, who played an integral role in the Irish peace process and who now leads Rethinking Conflict, an organization that works to resolve conflict on a global level. Next, we have Godwin A. Okoko, an experienced professional skilled at conflict prevention and peace building within communities in northern Nigeria. He's currently the director of program at Plateau State Peace Building Agency. Last but not the least, Stefan Ziegler currently works as a humanitarian trainer, facilitator, and independent film producer. He holds over 20 years of experience in the fields of research and advocacy related to humanitarian action. So, very warm welcome to all of you. And without further ado, I would like to pose the question to you: does international law provide language for meaningful dialogue? And Ashok, do you want to go right ahead and start?
Thank you, Nikon and Stefan for this opportunity. And my first response, it's a very quick response, is international law works and is really useful as long as there is any kind of a power behind it to enforce it. And the same is true, obviously, at a national or local level. Uh, One of the things that I have discovered is that the whole question of using the vocabulary or even the force or power of the law is meaningful only if there is a way to carry the process through and to enforce the law. So this is where I'm coming from right now, and I want to give the others who have probably worked on this an opportunity to weigh in, because my experience with law and the language and vocabulary of law having a place in conflict resolution, in bringing polarized groups together, in preventing atrocities, human rights atrocities, is that if there's nobody to back it up, that law is almost meaningless. So I'm just going to put it out there, and I'd love to hear from Godwin and Gary and Stefan, of course, because they've been working in these areas for a very long time.
Thank you, Ashok. Gary, do you want to go right ahead?
Yes, I mean, I had the pleasure of watching Broken last night, and I thought it was an excellent production. So congratulations to Stefan in relation to that. Interesting, I took a little bit of time today just to watch again the last 10 minutes. Just some of the quotations that were coming from very skilled actors. I mean, international law, one commentator says, is slow in delivering, but it can be a catalyst for change. Judge Moron said that in his profession he's dealt with war crimes, genocide, but he says he's an optimist in the long run that the law will have an impact. I suppose just very simply, just as we begin this conversation, I mean, I remember the Good Friday Agreement, the peace agreement in the Irish context, ending 30 years of a bloodbath in the northern part of the island of Ireland. It was interesting just reflecting on those comments last night, because George Mitchell, the American Democratic senator who Bill Clinton asked to chair the talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, the day the agreement was signed, George Mitchell said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and it was, implementing it will be even more difficult. So as I'm speaking to you today, 23 years plus after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. There are parts of that international agreement enshrined in international law that are still not implemented. That's my initial thoughts.
Yeah.
That's a sober realization. Thank you, Gary.
Godwin, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you think?
Thank you very much. Just to lean on what others have said concerning the international law, which of course is expected to be a global language for dialogue. I think that from my perspective, law is empty without the power of enforcement. Mm-hmm. From my perspective, it is totally empty. And then the question then puts that when we're talking about international law, who enforces?
Right.
This is a question that is posed to all of us. And of course, and when you have a law without an enforcer, at the end of the day, the law is still vague from my own perspective. And I want to share with you from the background where I come from, that one of the things that have also fueled the conflict that we have experienced in some part of northern Nigeria has to do with issues related to impunity. And this is also what we have seen. And of course, looking at the perspective of international law, it's supposed to be the medium through which nations comes together to dialogue, to have this conversation, to cooperate among themselves in such a manner that whatever are the conflicting issues among the nations are resolved amicably, that each party goes back home feeling satisfied. But then I think that it is more different from what we see. What I see for me, rather than international law that is supposed to speak towards dialogue, but I see more of a trial of balance of power. I see the law being enforced based on the power that you can exercise, based on a platform of domination, intimidation, threats. And this, of course, for me, it's not dialogue. From the understanding of dialogue, it's supposed to be a conversation that we both seek to understand and know each other very well. I can tell you, Nicola, when you're facing your right, standing opposite me, and somebody asked Godwin, can you see Nicola? I will say yes. And how many eyes does she have? I say 2, and a nose, I say 1. And of course, when somebody who is standing right behind you, they ask him the same question from the position he is standing, he will say, all I can see that Nico doesn't have an eye. And because of the position that he or she is standing, you cannot say he's lying. You cannot say he's not saying the truth. But this is also because most times we do not make a shift. And I see the international law tries to favor the stronger powers. And I see that the weak nations are like, but the essence of international law is to bring all states equal before that law. But is this the reality? We have to ask ourselves. How many nations have been invaded despite a lot of sanctions, a lot of words from the United Nations that is supposed to be the coordinating power for that? How many nations have been invaded? And so for me, it is supposed to, unfortunately, by the people that are expected to guide and protect this law, they are the one that breaks the law. And the weaker nations sees this also as a platform. And that's why sometimes you find out that the stronger nations find it very difficult to talk even in the eyes of impunity and corruptions in some nations. And so what is expected to be so, ironically, it's a different thing. And that's why a mentor of mine once said to me, he said, God, let me tell you something. There are 2 things you cannot be hypocritical about. And that is peace and love. If you don't have, you can give it. And I've seen a lot of hypocrisy on that platform as far as the international law is concerned. But if nations begin to respect the rules, begin to respect those laws, I am telling you, you will see a more prosperous, a more peaceful, a more united, a more cohesive world than what we are experiencing today. It is supposed to, and it is the language if it's being respected. But the question I asked, who enforced? Thank you.
Thank you, Godwin. And on this aspect of language, Ashok, do you want to jump right back in and say what you think?
Well, thank you. So, hearing both Godwin and Gary, one thing, and based on what I had also shared, it's become very clear that to have a law, even one that's agreed upon, even one that's enshrined in the books or even in the constitution, it's one thing. But it's a completely different thing to be able to live in accordance with the law, which requires some kind of power that can enforce the law. In other words, without accountability, this law is useless. But I want to take a step back and to ask ourselves a big question, which is, when did we start relying on law? When did we start relying on certain kinds of language? And I want to illustrate this with a very small example from India. I started doing very complex Hindu Muslim dialogues in India and with evangelist Christians too separately in 2007. And the first, I want to say, 7 to 8 years, the dialogues, we brought together the very powerful groups from each community, including the Catholic Church, when we worked with the Christians, the RSS, the VHP, when we brought in the Hindus, and the Jamaati Islamia, and some of the really devout and, I want to almost say, fundamentalist groups together. Until 2014, when the right-wing Hindu government came, the conversations, the dialogue was really based on the laws. They were based on India's secular platform. They were based on the constitution. I was midway through the dialogues in 2014 when the Modi government came into power. Literally from the next meeting, and these were full day meetings, very, very intense dialogues, I saw something fascinating happen. The Hindus who until then were very much part of the process, I would almost say that the Hindus were more interested in the dialogue than the Muslims were. But the moment Modi won, it almost looked as though the Hindus sat back and they said, there was a shift in their approach. And it was almost like, why does it matter what the law says? Why does it matter what the constitution says? Because this is all man-made. We can change it all. Now we have the power. We have come into power. We have an overwhelming majority, and any law that exists is not relevant to us anymore because we can change it. It has completely changed the status of the minority in India. It has changed the way the majority population looks at Muslims and Christians, and the law is almost irrelevant. I have been in touch with some other people in India working on dialogue with minority groups and majority groups, and the facilitators, are changing the framework of the dialogue. It's no longer equal rights. It is, how can we ensure that within the Hindu India, we can somehow get some rights to minorities. They have accepted the idea of Muslims being second-class citizens because the law is, as it existed in the past, is irrelevant now. So I just want to put it out there, and I'd love to hear from Gary, Stefan, and Godwin. However much we like the idea of this universal human rights based legal structure of international as well as national laws, what do we do when China becomes as powerful? What do we do when NATO and the EU doesn't have the power or interest in intervening? So I'll just leave it there.
Gary, would you like to take that up?
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to think of this. I was just thinking back to, I was in Jerusalem in 2016 for, it was a 5 to 6 day dialogue on transitional justice. And interestingly, it was organized by 2 law professors. And I suppose one of my cautions initially, I was worried that this was going to be driven very much within a legal framework, important as that is. But they were 2 sharp law professors, because they asked philosophers, historians, psychologists, theologians, negotiators to the table. So it's really, looking back on it, I guess I would have described it as a kind of multidisciplinary approach to peace building. So I would say the law cannot heal. I mean, the law is not a therapy.
Right.
I mean, the law can create a space, there's no question about that. But the reality is that law and fact are weak when you're dealing with powerful emotions. And in all these conflicted spaces that we're talking about, people here have expertise in India, Nigeria, and other spaces that I'm not working in. But for me, one of the biggest issues is it's the power of memory and legacy and dealing with the past. I mean, that is the ghost that still haunts Irish society. And a classic example of the Good Friday Agreement, it was specified that inside 2 years, weapons decommissioning should take place from non-state actors. It was 2005 before the IRA decommissioned their weapons. They wouldn't even use that word. It was 2009 before the loyalist non-state actors decommissioned their weapons. In fact, they read their statement out in my church building. That was June 2009, 11 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So I want to see law as crucial, as important, but I do want to see it as part of a wider dynamic of transitional justice where we need other actors at the table. I mean, all of us are primarily civic society actors, and we have this theory here, the political peace process versus the social peace process. I think if we leave peace processes in the hands of political actors, invariably they ground into the ground. I mean, if there's one lesson out of our fragile peace process, it's the role of civic society. I mean, I've often said, fragile as our peace process is, but civic society is actually the social glue that holds our peace process together. So I do want to argue law undoubtedly has a place, but as I said earlier, I mean, it's not a therapy, it's not a psychology, and law and fact are actually, they can be weak when you're dealing with powerful emotions within this realm of identity.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you, Gary. Stefan, we haven't heard from Stefan.
I'm reflecting upon what you're saying, but maybe if Godwin wants to come in, I'll go back to some of the things that were said and add my experience to this, okay? Because obviously after our session now, I will have the time to explain things throughout my presentation. Okay, thank you.
So Godwin, do you want to come in and comment?
Yeah, just to build on it, what I said, I totally agree with what he says, and of course, like Robert, one of the one-time president of the International Law of Justice, once said something. He said clearly that the principle and the importance and the essence of the international law is acceptability by all nations, and of course, irrespective of our social, political, or economic class. And I think generally, it says something that also catches my attention. He says that the law does not heal as such, rather it provides enabling environments for dialogue to thrive. And because we are from different nations, different races, different backgrounds, certainly that we will live in a world of differences, and certainly that because of our differences, there are bounds to be situations where we may disagree with each other, where we will not agree with each other, where we may have incompatible goals. And I think the most important and the essence of the international law is to promote a platform through which we can sit down and discuss our differences in such a way that at the end of it, we all leave the table satisfied. And I think that once that essence is lost, then everything is lost. But I see what I have seen even on the basis, under the platform, the umbrella of international law, what I have seen in recent times are threats, intimidation. This is no way dialogue, negotiation, but even the negotiations, some other parties are coming from the point of weakness. the point of fear. And then when you come to the table, you just take what they have to offer rather than also having an opportunity to talk about the issue. So I think that going forward, the international law, for it to be applicable, it must be accepted universally in such a way that what applies to country A is applying to country B. What is the decision of country A is a decision of country B. I have followed the trends, very sad trends, where nations comes together and say, no, we disagree about this. There is no need to invade. Other nations said, no, we are going on our own. Because sometimes also boils down to issues of self-defense of international of territory of nations. And so, and under the guise of self-defense, nations hide and they invade other nations. Well, it's the importance of the international law. If it does not cover you, it does not cover me, I think that it doesn't have the acceptability to me entirely. Because at the tail end, at the end of it, we have seen even where sovereign nations are invaded, president or head of state are arrested and picked for. And so I think that if it has to be an acceptable language for all of us, then it means that what is good for you is also good for me. What is not good for me is also not good for me. But basically, I think it's supposed to provide a platform for all of us to sit down on a table. We must not close doors to dialogue. This afternoon, while I was chatting with you, I told you that I was facilitating a dialogue forum between farmers and HADA, and in the community where they have been experiencing this conflict between pastoralists and sedentary farmers, and the conflict has lasted 21 years. And there are concerted efforts by both state and non-state actors to resolve the differences. But sometimes when you think that you are progressing, then all of a sudden something will come in like a spark. They want to put a clock in the wheel of progress. And we just finished the dialogue and agreed on some resolutions. But like you know, there are always shadows. There are always conflict entrepreneurs. While one of the parties were going back to their destinations, they were ambushed on the way. And this part of what also delayed. And we kept talking with them and all that. And the sincerity, honesty, it's not there in the whole process. And I want to close on this to state that as long as nations live under the pretense or under the illusion that they can survive in isolation, or they are the strongest power and others are weak, I want to tell you, we're not going to have the kind of stability we so desire globally. Until we begin to see ourselves from the perspective of shared humanity, our nations, our world will not prosper in such a way that we so much desire. Thank you.
Can I just say, Godwin and the others, that I think we have to also pay attention to what is happening geopolitically. We are all very conscious in the pre-Brexit, pre-Trump era that illiberal democracy is a form which is gaining far more acceptance, whether it's Hungary or Poland, or certainly India is going down that path right now. But let's be very clear, whether it's the entire Arab Gulf, whether it's China, whether it's more authoritarian governments in many parts of the world, we have to recognize that the norms that we are talking about for dialogue, which come out of the post-World War II attempt to create the kind of equal status that Godwin has been talking about, both internationally as well as domestically, I think that is under so much threat. I struggle to see how, with an ascendant China and an America, the US, which is retreating into its own boundaries, and with Europe struggling, I struggle to see how we can have, or we can continue to grow the project of an international world order based on rule of law, based on equality. And I mean, the last 7 years, the only thing I have been doing really is on trying to get people to recognize the fragility and the vulnerability of democratic societies, particularly the ones that are still active in the West, for instance. Because if these democracies fail or they become weaker, and we get the right wing or the ultra conservatives taking over, the nationalists taking over in many of the Western countries today, I do not expect to see any kind of international law preventing the people that Godwin is talking about, the bullies, the powerful countries, the dominant groups in different countries from controlling the discourse. The negotiation that Godwin is talking about, which will be manipulated, it's already happening. I mean, any country that negotiates with China today knows that China will not play by the book. Whether it's in the South Seas, whether it's in Tibet, whether it's in Ladakh, whether it's in its relationship with Pakistan or India or Philippines, China is a law unto itself. It accepts international law only when it suits them. Now, there are other countries that are doing the same thing now across the world. So in this changed global environment, what is the place for international law anyway? I'm going to leave with this question of mine.
It's interesting, Godwin, just you used a phrase there, which kind of really resonated with me. And your phrase was, how do people leave the table satisfied? I suppose looking back to the Good Friday Agreement, the imperfect, it's not the panacea for the world's ills. But one of the key components that George Mitchell tried to do was to create a win-win situation for both sides. And he was encouraging people to look at the other and to ensure that the other had enough to go back to their constituency to get their constituency over the line. There was an article, a guy in the United States wrote a number of years ago entitled, "Humiliation is the Root of All Terrorism." I want to condemn terrorism categorically and unashamedly. I've spent my life as a persuader for non-violence of those who have pursued political violence or terrorism. But the irony is, and we have to acknowledge this, painful as it may be, if you continually humiliate another person, at least let's say you leave open the possibility that they may choose violence. Wrongly, by all means, but at least let's be honest and say we leave open that possibility. The other thing to say as well, and really what Ashok was saying there, this concept of interests versus identity. I mean, most of us in this call, and I imagine many of our colleagues and friends, are people of interests. We want to live in a market economy. We want to live in a liberal democracy. But again, as we've said, the rise of identity politics globally is phenomenal. Now, there's nothing wrong with identifying as Irish or British or European or Indian or feminist or whatever. But if you combine identity with ethno-nationalism, it becomes a different story. National identity is okay. But if you combine ethnic identity into that concept, that my ethnicity is better, and I suppose as a religious actor as well, we have been plagued with what I call, and you've alluded to this, Ashok, as well, theologies of superiority. The God is on my side mentality, which is prevalent in so many spaces today. And we all know when conflict takes place, invariably it's about land, identity, and religion. They're always bubbling around below the surface, above the surface, to a greater or lesser degree.
Okay, for the sake of not making this a whole day's presentation, if I may, I'll just come in on a few things, and I'm not the judge. Huh? I'm not judging anybody. I think what I can say is, I think you're all right in the sense that I have these debates almost twice or three times weekly when we show the film in cinemas and so on and online. And it shows that a lot of people are, I think, disenfranchised by law and disgruntled by law, okay? But there are obviously other sides to law. And maybe to Godwin, I would say, try the word ethics, because law is a codification of ethics, and those we harbor as human beings. And that might give a different color to this discussion altogether. But you made reference to that. I understand, Godwin. The other thing is, I believe you work in an area where there's a lot of refugees, not least from Cameroon, correct?
Yeah.
I think refugee law is probably one of the best codified laws that you can have for protection of people. If it's enforced, I totally agree, okay? But it's an interesting body that a lot of people can't afford. You know, climate refugees, economic migrants, they have nowhere near the kind of protection by law as, let's say, refugees afford. Now, I've worked long enough in countries and lived in Ireland to understand that international law is only as strong as the person or the politicians or, you know, implement it. That's clear, absolutely clear. But there is one other side which I would like to refer to. It's this kind of reciprocity, and you've all mentioned this. It's, well, you will see in one of the interviews that we have filmed for this presentation for the summit, and he says it in very simple terms. He's a well-renowned international law practitioner, and he says, well, if it's not okay to drink your coffee, then it's not okay for somebody to drink mine. And this is very simple. But when I was working in war-torn places, no matter where they were, that's not so important, to be able to say to the soldier at a checkpoint, you know, are you sure that the treatment you give to people that are not of your own is correct? And he would say, of course, you know, we're the army here, we're in charge. I said, okay, try and turn this around. What if you are on the other side being treated exactly the way you've been treated here? I think that has a great strength in us practitioners here to actually use international law to a degree which one other person is going to say to you in my presentation. He says, you know, in the absence of law, there's only chaos. And for me, the language where I learned to use the language of international law the strongest, and where I became the implementer of international law, was when I worked for the International Committee of the Red Cross in prisons, where you argue the standard for a prisoner, okay, the treatment of a prisoner, not based on anything else but the fourth or the whatever Geneva Conventions that apply. So, having said this, and you will see later on in my film, I'm very critical of international law. I've lived 10 years between the Palestinian and Israeli people. I've been monitoring the wall between the two people, and I realized there's an absolute absence of willingness and other to tackle international law. So I leave you with one little piece of information, which normally I don't give away before the film has been seen. But you see behind me, it says broken. And before you saw the film, you probably ask yourself, what is broken? You know, is it international law that's broken? I don't think so. International law is what it is. It's a code on a piece of paper, it used to be, and now it's electronic. But the film's title refers to broken promises of international law. And I leave you at that, okay? But thank you very much anyway for a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I think that was a wonderful way to end such an enriching panel discussion. So I would really like to thank Ashok, Gary, as well as Godwin, along with Stefan, to be a part, for being a part of this wonderful panel and sharing your views, talking about the film a little bit, as well as the relevance of international law, as in terms of a bigger picture. And really grateful. Thank you so much. That was a wonderfully enriching panel discussion. Stefan, it was wonderful knowing about your filmmaking journey, but it would be wonderful to also know about your research, advocacy, and educational experiences. So, would you like to introduce us to that as well?
Sure. Well, listen, Nikon, thank you very much for that. Yes, I think, we've had a first 45 minutes of a discussion, which was a great introduction to my film work, but there is work in my film and with my film that really has an educational basis. And I will only be happy with myself if by the end of my presentation, both of these aspects will have been declared and people understand how important it is to work with visuals in education, because it's the next generation that counts.
Well, hello again. Delighted that we had this great opportunity to hold a panel discussion with people that I presume have come before me. This is before the program is actually written up for reasons of COVID and other, presumably other reasons. But anyway, first of all, I really want to thank the organizers of this summit to give me the opportunity to speak about things that are very close to my heart. And I will tell you a little bit more about this in a few minutes. But also to thank once again my colleagues that have contributed to this opening session with a debate about international law that I felt on reflection has been, I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better introduction. I think we heard so many things about international law expressing almost fear at times, which I share entirely as an international humanitarian worker with over 20 years of experience. I can see that there is no great opportunity for alternatives, but I'm delighted to have you here and delighted to share my ideas and hope contribute a little bit to the justice that's being sought, whatever that means to whoever people are at stake here. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, I have 20 years of background in humanitarian action. That means I've worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, as I said earlier on. But I think the time that shaped me most in terms of what I'm doing right now, and that is producing film of humanitarian needs, and I chose the topic of international law not because I'm a lawyer, but because I lived law, as you wish to say that, when with populations that are vulnerable, that may be one of the tools that is a ready one to pick up in order to defend those beneficiaries. It doesn't always work, as we have seen in the debate, but there I am. And maybe the one thing that I will speak about it after we looked at the second part of our presentation is I'm really trying to push to use filmmaking to lecture with in education in general, and that I will see with you later on, and hopefully get some feedback from the audience as we go along. So, as I said, from the year 2004 or 2005, I started working with a UN agency in the Middle East, precisely UNRWA, a refugee agency, one of the largest UN agencies that there is. And very soon after I started my work in dealing with access issues in the West Bank for Palestinian refugees, but also in protection, and some of our programs obviously were also of an assistance nature. But protection is probably the one that led me most to think about how to give voice, if you wish, from my position to people that didn't have that much voice. And that became, if you wish, my logo. It's also enshrined on my webpage. It didn't leave me alone, because more than anything else, it's language that people need to be able to hear or use to be heard. And that's the kind of language that we're talking about in our session now, that is entitled International Law, Provider of Language for Meaningful Dialogue. And I hope throughout my presentation now that I can give you reasons to believe that with me, that there is language. International law will give us certain language, but we need to learn it. I think this is not just something ready-made for various reasons. I don't think the purely legalistic approach to international law will make anybody listen more or less to people that are in needs and vulnerable. So, yes, I've been turned into a filmmaker, or let's say a film producer, I should say, and maybe I will also try myself at filmmaking later on. But at the moment, I've turned to film, and you will see this in a little video clip that we're playing for you, which is the genesis of my film, Broken, a Palestinian journey through international law. It deals with the broken promises, as I already said in the opening panel, where people are let down, although the law exists, and maybe very often on their side, but how to tap into that was probably the one big question that stayed with me, even after my 10 years working for the UN, monitoring the West Bank wall or barrier, depending on whose discourse you're listening to. I'm using wall because it's the human rights organizations of the UN, OHCHR, that uses the term wall, and so have the courts like the International Court of Justice. I was often asked in the field, why do you call it wall? Because it's maybe more like a fence, it's more of maybe a barrier. My question was always, my answer was always, now, presumably this is the person that I'm talking to, is using a computer, and most of these computers nowadays have a firewall built in, although it probably doesn't look like a wall either. But I think the term wall has a much more effective ring to it, and so this is why I'm using the term, and have been using it ever since I left the United Nations. And well, asking yourself, why do I, give up my career, if you wish, as a humanitarian worker for the UN in the Middle East? This is best explained through the little video clip that we made for my film. And it's the genesis of my project, and it's been with me for the last 7 years, albeit I do other work as well. I keep educational things up, like lecturing, and I'm training and so on. But my main interest is with the film, and I'll let you watch that for yourself right now. For me, it's a very personal question. I've been working in the West Bank for 8 years, and I had already left Palestine, but was there for a few weeks to do cleaning up and getting things ready and so on to move back to Europe. I was on the plane from Tel Aviv to Zurich, and I thought to myself, well, there's only two things I can do. Either I can go walk away and get another job somewhere else and close that chapter in my own life, but I felt I couldn't just leave 750,000 potential beneficiaries behind, knowing that I was probably the one person that had the most knowledge about these particular impacts. But I thought a film can, or hopefully will have, a certain amount of impact for those people that I didn't want to just leave behind.
You know, if international law was as strong as this wall here, the wall wouldn't be here. And I'm not naive to believe that my film is going to bring down the wall, but if it strengthens international law, I'll be a very happy man.
I hope you understand that this 1.2 minutes of genesis, as we call it, of the film Broken, probably explains more than I could have explained to you, speaking to you. And I think that's also the power of the filmmaking, the filmmaker. Mohammed Al-Attar has done a great job on putting my ideas into this film, into a visual, into something that can be shared. So you will see later on during our session, in a few minutes' time, you will actually get to see the film Broken, albeit in a shortened version, something like 20 minutes, giving you the main points about the project that I started 7 years ago. In 2018, the film came out. We had our premiere in Geneva, amongst others at the United Nations headquarters of the United Nations in Geneva. It was a great opportunity to meet with people that were directly linked to this film. So it wasn't a film festival as such. It was probably more like a working environment. That was a highlight. We did multiple projects like this over the years now, but you know, it's not, for me, coming from a totally different background than filmmaking and film production especially, it took time, and I think it took 7 years for me to be here where I am, feeling confident enough to say that the project that we started, which was an idea, no more than an idea, actually came to fruition. And for me, the most important thing is that the film is shown to audiences that are receptive. And that I found sometimes in film festivals, but predominantly at universities where the film has probably screened more than anywhere else. The film is also available to teaching staff, and it's readily used. With modern technology, it's fantastic. Even when the students are not able to be at their campus because of COVID or other, still we can share these moments with them and having debates. And I probably enjoy those the most, because you can see that the fruit of your idea becomes a reality, and it does show how people are ready to learn, are ready to give input. So there is an emotional level that I found incredibly rewarding. So keep going, if I may say so. After Broken, just a quick introduction. We have 2 film projects that are on its way. One of them is called Broken for the Curious. It's an adaptation of the first film, the one that you'll see. It is using pedagogical tools in order to lower the average age. I would say broken is probably something that most people would not appreciate very much until maybe they're 23, 24, going maybe into a master's in various fields of studies. So we're now trying to actually achieve a version for 14-year-olds and upwards. Of that, maybe a little bit more when I talk about education, but that is one of the projects that we hope will be finished within the next couple of months. And again, a great team of people working with me on these things, either technically and especially in terms of research and so on. That said, we have started a series of international law interviews with experts, both in the field and at teaching institutions. It isn't by no means finished, this project, but we've started uploading it and making it available to the public. Behind the Chambers, is the film that looks at how international law is both currently held up or not, and what the prospects are for international law in general. Now, I'm mentioning this because much of what's to come in my presentation has to do with film material from those experts talking in great detail and unhindered. We let our interview partners talk freely. We will be using these to illustrate what those experts have to say about different types of conflicts, and of them we have at least 12 that will be named, starting maybe with the German reunification, but the wall and the meaning of borders, particularly hard borders. But we also hear from people talking about the Catalan struggle, if you wish, Northern Ireland again a little bit, but certainly I'm very happy to also introduce you to people with whom we work on the African continent. But okay, that's just taking you a little bit through the next few minutes of the presentation. But first I would like to tell you that I came across a word that I haven't used in a long time, and that is the kaleidoscope. And when I was thinking about this presentation and also talking to the organizers, I said, you know, I'm not an expert in international law, so it's not for me to talk about international law with great insight, but maybe because of my field work, I see where international law is lacking, or where the understanding is lacking, and so on. And I thought, well, if I have a presentation, I would like to show my audience, you and here today, the value of mixing different types of media. And here, obviously, it has to do with film. And my kaleidoscope idea, which is probably best described as a methodology for this presentation, will run through deep ideas that I hope will be contributing to this summit more than anything else, and to the people for whom this summit has been called. In this sense, I would like to start with a colleague of mine, Professor Alfred de Zayas, who was also our first Behind the Chambers interview partner, and just let him talk from his experience and for you to appreciate how somebody reflects about a long career in international law, but also in international relations, teaching, and so no further ado, but I let you get on with that, and I'll see you after that. Okay, thank you.
We have a complete breakdown in the concept of accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity, and then the organ that is supposed to carry out investigations will not even carry out the investigations, let alone conduct a trial. So, quis custodiet ipsos custodes? What do you do when the watchdog doesn't watch? Who is going to watch over the watchdog? You, me, civil society. At least we should be aware that we have been betrayed. We should be aware that the International Criminal Court has let the world down. Now take the International Court of Justice. I said that the raison d'etre of setting up a system of human rights protection is enforcement. We just don't like window dressing. We like to see some action. We like to help rehabilitate the victims. We want to have reparation for the victims. Well, the International Court of Justice ordered reparation for the victims, etc., in the Nicaragua against the United States judgment of 1986 to no avail because the United States ignored it. The International Court of Justice, in an advisory opinion concerning the wall, 2004, made its recommendations 15 years ago, totally ignored. The International Court of Justice just recently ordered the United Kingdom to let the people of the Chagos Islands return to their islands. I mean, this was a major violation of all principles of decolonization when the United Kingdom simply took away the Chagos Islands from Mauritius and then leased them off to the United States so that you can have this huge military base, Diego Garcia. Now the population was expelled, etc., untold suffering to the population of the Chagos Islands, and of course the United Kingdom thus far has ignored the judgment of the International Court of Justice. What does that tell you? We have courts, but the judgments are not implemented. Do you need such expensive courts? How about just giving reparation directly to the victims, rather than going through the, shall we say, disingenuous procedures of the International Court of Justice or of the International Criminal Court? I am very dismayed at the fact that positivism seems to be the order of the day and a fetishism of the law. I would call a fetishism of the law. Dura lex et lex, so you have to follow the law, regardless whether the law is good or bad. I see that in the context of, say, legitimate aspirations of self-determination by various peoples. Take the Catalans. My colleague here at the University of Geneva, Professor Nicolas Levrat, published in September 2017 a very important book concerning the right of the Catalan people to decide. It's not a report on their right to secession or their right to independence, but their right to hold a referendum, which was affirmed by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, by myself in my function as independent expert at the time. It was reaffirmed by quite a few of our colleagues to no avail. I'm talking about here the problem of recognition of self-determination as a conflict prevention strategy. It is not self-determination that causes conflict or war. It is the unjust denial of the exercise of self-determination that leads to conflict. Now, the International Court of Justice, back in 2010, issued the advisory opinion on Kosovo. Paragraph 80 of that advisory opinion is very clear. The principle of territorial integrity in all of its use in the United Nations, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, Resolution 2625 of the General Assembly, also its use in the context of the OECD, in the Helsinki Declaration, and also in the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and all of these things. Principle of territorial integrity is for external use only, meaning state A cannot encroach, cannot invade, cannot occupy state B. So the territorial integrity of state B is guaranteed by international law. But the principle of territorial integrity cannot negate, cannot replace the right of self-determination of peoples, which is enshrined in the UN Charter, Article 1, and in Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights.
Welcome back. You know, while I was watching this excerpt of this interview that we held almost 1.5 years ago by now, the one thing that came to my mind is what a privilege it is to be making these kinds of projects work, here film or an interview, to film it and to reflect upon it. And I have to say, even after 1.5 years, I'm still picking up things that were said by Alfred or others. I feel that learning never stops if you're open for it. So in this sense, I want to introduce you to another person that I haven't actually met yet in person, but with whose organization we're planning to do an educational film tour of Ghana I'm talking about Migikra Erasmus Endemole, who kindly took his time out of his job in South Sudan, where I know he's very busy these days, but he's also the director of the West African Center for Peace Studies. And the Center and Advocacy Productions, we are trying to see how we could put together a 10-day tour with the film, both as a documentary film, but also as an educational tool, and weave that into parts of the society in Ghana that might be interested in learning more about international law, and taking them away from their own contexts also, to be able to abstract and probably learn from the experience here, in this case, of the International Court of Justice, and that we will see directly after Erasmus's piece. So thank you very much, and happy viewing.
My name is Mijikra Erasmus Ndemle. I'm the Executive Director of West Africa Center for Peace Studies. I'm a lawyer by profession and a humanitarian peace and conflict activist, specialized in also children in armed conflict situation. This afternoon, I'm here to encourage, to advise our colleagues in Cameroon that peace is the answer to the situation in Cameroon. Conflict distracts a lot of things from international law perspective. Most conflicts that we've witnessed in the world, we have seen that there have been accountability. If we take in the 90s, Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, we have seen where presidents, we have seen where individuals have been accountable. Apart from that, we have also witnessed in most countries that I have had chance to work, like Darfur, like South Sudan, even Kenya, and some other places, who have witnessed and seen refugee situations, either they are receiving or people fleeing from those countries to other countries. Statistics will even tell you that over millions of South Sudanese are currently in a place like Uganda, places like Kenya, and other countries. Apart from that, it's so glaring that there can be also internally displaced person. At least the refugees are usually backed by the 1951 Refugee Convention and OAU or AU Refugee Convention, Cartagena Refugee Convention. But the internal displaced persons always have issue because they have to live by the same laws that is being run by their persecutors. Therefore, I would say that from the peace point of view, from international law point of view, conflict is not the best, and it has a lot of challenges that could lead into humanitarian crisis. Apart from humanitarian crisis, the whole country gets disrupted. And rebuilding a country, what we call post-conflict reconstruction, leads to a lot of money, a lot of human resource. But if people then has been exterminated or died, all this thing will not come. So I urge colleagues from Cameroon from both sides to really know that there can be accountability. Therefore, they should tread with caution and not to indulge into act or violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Thank you.
So this was Erasmus Indomale, and I have to say, you know, when you're in the middle of work in the field and in very difficult circumstances, presumably, appreciatively especially, you know, I really want to thank him for his effort there and covering, I think, you know, crucial areas, and not to least to also share maybe his insights with you know, the people for whom this summit has been called, the Cameroonians. And I think you know, it gives you also a sense of not everything is filmed in studios. Things are kind of live, even if it's recorded. So thanks again, Erasmus, and I'm looking forward to working with your organization in Ghana very soon, and hopefully beyond, also in West Africa. Now, finally, we're coming to the film that we created a short version of, so that it fits into my presentation here. I don't think you need much of an introduction to this. Should you be interested in knowing more about the film, our production, please revert back to the websites. And well, I leave you with Broken, a Palestinian journey through international law, and I will see you after that. Okay.
My name is John Dugard. I am a retired professor of international law, and I am a judge ad hoc at the International Court of Justice, that is, a part-time judge. In 2001, I was appointed as Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, and I held that mandate until 2008. In June 2003, I carried out a visit to the Palestinian territory, and I focused very much on the construction of the wall. And what alarmed me was that most of it was being built in Palestinian territory. In response to my report, the General Assembly of the United Nations had adopted a resolution in which they demanded that Israel halt the construction of the wall. The Secretary General requested the Security Council to endorse the call for Israel to dismantle the wall, but that was vetoed by the United States. And so, in despair, as it were, with no alternative, the General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to give an advisory opinion on the legality of the wall.
I was very desperate, and the reason for that was not the veto itself. I mean, we got used to US vetoes before. The reason was that the US led us to believe that on this matter, they are not going to compromise. So the big question was what to do. And only then we started contemplating the idea of seeking the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice.
A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting. Please signify.
The voting has been completed. The machine is locked.
The result of the voting is as follows. In favor, 90. Opposed, 8. Abstentions, 74. Draft resolution is adopted.
Thousands of miles away from New York, the case is on its way to the beautiful Dutch city of The Hague, home to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and the birthplace of international law.
A lot of people would tell you it was the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius who invented the rule of international law in the 16th century. It was chaos. It was chaos. Everybody was fighting each other. There were wars all over the world. Europe was a mess, in flames. And this man comes up with this idea of the freedom of the high seas. You know, no more piracy. There should be freedom and people should be left alone. And more importantly, when states go to war, there are rules.
At the Peace Palace where the court sits, preparations are underway to receive what have been called one of the most visible cases in the court history. Israel has refused to participate in the court proceedings and instead submitted 130 pages document arguing that the ICJ has no jurisdiction over the case and does not have enough evidence to hear the case.
It's very important to understand that this was not a contentious case between two states. And so Israel was making its case in the court of public opinion at the gates of the Peace Palace in The Hague through numerous interviews on TV, whereas we were arguing the case in court.
I lost my daughter in a bus explosion in Haifa, and I think that building such a fence and letting us building such a fence will be a smart thing.
The court in The Hague has no authority to deal with political issues.
The victim is the accused. Just shows you that the United Nations has taken, including this one, are against Israel, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish.
The odds in this particular proceeding are so politically stacked. We don't want to give this proceeding a legitimacy that it doesn't deserve.
This morning, the court will hear Palestine.
I stand before you as a representative of the Palestinian people, the indigenous people of the land, who for too long have been denied the right to self-determination and sovereignty over their land, and half of whom remain refugees. They have been dehumanized and demonized, humiliated and demeaned, dispossessed and dispersed, and brutally punished by their occupier. This case, however, is not about the whole of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is about the wall. This wall is being constructed almost entirely in the occupied Palestinian territory.
Now I give the floor to Professor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the court, it's an honor for me to appear before you and to have been entrusted with this part of Palestine's presentation. Mr. President, the issue here is not whether Israel has the right to build a wall. It is whether it has the right to build the wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. And Palestine's main point is that whatever security effects the wall might have could be secured by building the wall along the Green Line on Israeli territory.
If Israel wanted a wall for security, it could construct it on its territory and raise it to 80 meters rather than 8 meters if it wished. This would not bode well for mutual coexistence, of course, but no one would challenge its legality in principle.
The wall, insofar as it departs from the Green Line and is built in occupied Palestinian territory, cannot be justified by appeals to Israel's security interests. States cannot cast off all legal and moral constraints by merely calling on the name of security interests.
In the present case, there is not one report, but many. The reports of competent bodies, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Human Rights Committee, the Special Rapporteur of the Commission on Human Rights, and so on. They tell a concordant story. The court is perfectly well informed. If Israel wished to challenge the circumstances and facts set out in these reports, it could have done so. Israel cannot plead lack of facts as a ground to have the court refuse to decide, when any deficiency in the facts could have been corrected by Israel itself.
Israel maintains that the wall, on which it's said to be spending around $2 billion US, 2,000 million US dollars, is temporary. That's difficult to believe. One might take a different view if the Israeli government were to announce publicly now that it recognizes that the Palestinian territory is occupied territory, that it recognizes that all of the settlements are in occupied Palestinian territory. The wall is changing the status of the occupied Palestinian territory. It is entirely foreseeably causing demographic and other changes that will eliminate the possibility of the Palestinian people effectively exercising their right to self-determination. And this is tantamount to a de facto annexation of territory. Well, Israel admits that the route of the wall is designed to protect Israeli civilian settlements, which have been built in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. The map speaks for itself. The wall departs from the Green Line in order to fix the settlements on what is no doubt thought of as the Israeli side of the line. Well, those settlements were themselves created in violation of international law. Article 49, paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the transfer by an occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the occupied territory. Numerous Security Council and General Assembly resolutions have determined that the settlement activities breach international law. The logic, sir, is inescapable. The civilian settlements are unlawful. Therefore, there is no right to divert the wall from the Green Line in order to protect those unlawful settlements.
Since the signing in 1993 of the Declaration of Principles between the Government of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, Israel not only continued its illegal settlement activities and expansion, but actually doubled the number of its settlers in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Doubled.
This creates facts on the ground. Palestinians are, in fact, being driven out of areas adjacent to the wall and adjacent to Israel. Some think that Israel is content to rule the occupied Palestinian territory without formally annexing it, because annexation would make it difficult to deny citizenship, voting rights, and equality before the law to those born in that territory. The question before the court, sir, is whether the wall, as described in the Secretary-General's report, violates international humanitarian law and international human rights law.
The lawyers are done with their arguments, and the 15-nation panel of judges is now in seclusion, wrestling with the case. While we wait for the court to issue its opinion, and not far from the ICJ, another court and another judge, Judge Theodore Miron. Judge Miron has nothing to do with the wall case, except that 50 years ago, in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank, he was the legal advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Okay? In September of 1967, just a very, very short time after the war, when Israel conquered the entire West Bank, the office of the Prime Minister asked me for an opinion about the legality, well known, of Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements on the West Bank. Would they conform with international law? Would they conform with Geneva Convention? I gave such an opinion. It was a short one, but quite clear. And the opinion stated that settlements on the Jewish settlements on the West Bank would be in clear conflict with Article 49 of the Forced Geneva Convention. Maybe it was not the opinion he expected, but that's life. When I went last time to the West Bank and saw all those settlements on the hilltops, I said to myself, my God, what are we doing? It's bad. It's bad. It's bad for the two peoples. It's bad for any prospects for a peaceful settlement.
Please be seated. The court, from the material available to it, is not convinced that the specific course Israel has chosen for the war was necessary to attain its security objectives. The court accordingly finds that the construction of the wall and its associated regime are contrary to international law. Finally, the court is of the view that the United Nations should consider what further action is required to bring to an end the illegal situation resulting from the construction of the wall and the associated regime, taking due account of the present advisory opinion.
Good afternoon. The 27th meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution entitled Advisory Opinion on the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences of the construction of a wall in the occupied Palestinian territory. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process.
The Voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 150. Against, 6. 10 abstentions. Draft resolution is adopted.
With the U.S., the most powerful country nowadays, and with the silence of the European Union and other countries, Israel feels that they have free hand to do whatever they want. So this is the main reason why the ruling was never implemented. Bethlehem is a very small town, and it's getting smaller and smaller. The lands are confiscated by the Israelis. Settlements built around Bethlehem from all sides. And with the wall and closing all the sides of the city, Bethlehem now is smaller than the time of Jesus. As you see, this checkpoint where we are now, this is like a hole in the wall. It's the only way to go. And these workers you see going through this checkpoint are only the lucky ones who get permits from the Israelis to go. They come here at 4 in the morning in order to reach their work by 8, because they need 3-4 hours to go through the checkpoint. And they come back, they sleep 2-3 hours in order to prepare and get up and come back here. You just follow the orders and go and walk through this tunnel, and inside you will be boiling with anger.
"14 years ago, when the International Court of Justice issued its opinion, many people thought it was a historic turning point in the bloody conflict. But history didn't turn. Why is the wall still here after the court opinion? What happened to international law and to all of the UN resolutions? My search for answers takes me on a journey across 3 continents, hoping to make sense out of a senseless story. My first stop, Washington, D.C., home of Judge Thomas Bergenthal, the American judge and the only dissenting judge on the panel. I begin by asking him, why is the court opinion was not implemented?
It was predictable. It was predictable that the court would decide the case and it would have no effect on the wall in the first place. And that's why the court should never have been decided. The court should have rejected to hear the case.
So you're not really surprised that the wall case didn't go anywhere?
No. And do you think that the Palestinians were surprised? I know that some Palestinians were surprised because, unfortunately, they were made to believe that this decision was going to have an effect. unfortunately.
You know, I mean, you can call me naive. I'm one of them. I really thought that after the ICJ opinion, business will not be business as usual.
I was hoping that would be the case, but I knew it would be.
Well, how can you respect the court then?
How can you respect the UN General Assembly to be sending you a case where they basically know it's not going to have any effect? Do you think that the 100-some countries that referred it to the court thought that the court is now going to decide the case and the wall is going to fall down? They didn't believe it.
The whole purpose of the wall is to encircle 80% of the settlements in the West Bank and to draw them into Israel itself, to redraw the boundary of the state of Israel to include 80% of the settlements.
The case comes to the court. The court renders a decision and the wall is still there. If you want to really destroy international law, bring more of those cases to the court and show how ineffective international law is.
The United States was running the show, and the United States was determined that the advisory opinion of the wall, on the wall, should be killed.
I think the last word had not been spoken, and I think the wall opinion is a good thing. I think it's not perfect. I would love to rewrite parts of it here and there, of course, together with colleagues. But I think it is one of the decisions that the court can be proud of.
You tell me that that Palestinians don't believe in international law. I can't help it. I mean, I think they have if they relied on international law to solve all of the problems, they probably have good reasons not to believe in it.
Well, let's just hope that people will be more constructive, more law-abiding, more brotherly, more logical, more contemplative, less emotional, less nationalistic, less arrogant. And these are our hopes. These are my hopes in any event.
Well, I'm glad you're able to see that which I've invested 7 years of my life into. And I would, of course, very much love to hear feedback from you. I think there is a possibility to do this via the platform, but I'm obviously also available on LinkedIn and our webpage bears an email address. So yes, as I said, for us it's a journey, and it has only just begun. So I hope that the film will contribute to a little bit more justice, maybe, as it is meant to enlighten people and not just. It shouldn't just work for one day and that's it. It should really generate ideas. And I know this is working because I get feedback from university students, teaching staff, or just ordinary people giving us feedback in fora and so on. And that kind of introduces my second part to the presentation, which I would like to use to spell out my ideas about education with film, and in particular humanitarian documentaries, and again, in particular, looking through the prism, if you wish, of international law.